Hi Year 11s, welcome to our third creative writing lesson. This time we're moving on from characterization and talking about setting and atmosphere. Now, don't try and think of those too much as being completely separate, because in essence, a good character will always engage with their setting and atmosphere in a way that develops them and the story. So they are quite difficult to separate from one another, but obviously the best way to start out is simplifying it. So we start out with something on its own, unisolated, and then we can work together to bring it together later on. So in this lesson we're looking at describing setting an atmosphere in a memorable way. To begin with, there is a picture here of a parsonage, which is a church house often provided for a member of the clergy, behind a graveyard with some trees. And what I want you to do is write a paragraph describing what you see in this picture, specifically focusing on the feeling or the atmosphere that you believe is created by it. And for the stretch task, in the foreground and background, what is helping to create that atmosphere for you. So take a few minutes, have a look more closely at this picture, and then come up with writing your own paragraph, and then you can come back to the video and move on. Okay, now this is the next task starts with a description of that same house from Elizabeth Gaskell's writing on the life of Charlotte Bronte from 1857, so quite some time ago. And her description is inevitably going to be very different to yours. But what I'd like you to do is read through it and look for specific, precise, factual information first. So what is there in there that is very specifically not an opinion but a fact? Then what is the impression of the feel overall and how is that created? And lastly, what's the tone? How is that tone of this description different to the tone that you wrote about? So to help you with that, there are 6 things you might be looking out for within that extract. So the way to tackle this is start by reading through the extract and answering those questions with one eye on those 6 things at the bottom that might help direct you to answers for those questions. Once you've done that, come back and we'll show you where those are and how they've helped you answer. Okay, so firstly, the factual information is normally going to be found where there are clear nouns and clear, precise factual words. So for example, the house is of grey stone, 2 stories high. That's undeniable. If you go back to the picture, you'll be able to see that for yourself. So as a factual bit of information, that is clear. That opening sentence where it says roofed with flags in this case being kind of flagstone, slate roof, that is factual. So you could say flagged, roof with flags, but the idea of heavily is quite subjective. So in essence, that kind of qualifies the statement a little bit. And there are a number of things that are caveated by phrases like it appears to have been built 100 years ago. So they don't fall into the category of being factual, or whilst they may be noun phrases, they certainly aren't when it comes to being exact and precise. So then where it says about 100 years ago, this adverbial of time, that starts to lead us into our second question. So what impression we're given. So we're given the impression that even in 1857 it was quite an old house, or quite well established. So that gives us an idea that it may be newer properties, newer houses, don't often find themselves as being settings where horror movies take place. It's normally the old creaky mansion or the abandoned fairground or something which has an essence of decay about it or decrepitude. I've then picked out a preposition of on the right, and that's not necessarily any more detail than that, but the idea that it establishes some factual information. So the 2 windows on the right, as the visitor stands is back to the church, ready to enter at the front door, it allows you to start positioning yourself as if you were there. So those prepositions just enable you to start putting your feet in the shoes rather of the author. The opinion here is what starts to build up our impression, but also the tone. So the most dainty order, the most exquisite cleanliness, that tells us a lot about what the author thinks of organisation and cleanliness. The idea that it's dainty and precise and exquisite is highly valued and beautiful. So that straight away starts telling us that the tone is is very positive, it's very polite, it's very pristine, it's very encouraging, and the writer herself is quite happy and proud of this this building. So then we're developing the description with a simile, as the writer used that the old-fashioned window panes glitter like looking glass, so like mirrors, which again, in and of itself, is not necessarily that useful, but allows to picture it. So the sunlight shining off of it, the reflection of the garden or the graveyards, something a little bit more beautiful and a bit more mysterious, perhaps. And lastly, a summarising sentence at the end kind of closes out this description with an overall sort of perspective, which is inside and outside of that house, cleanliness goes up into its essence, purity. Again, that repetition of the idea of cleanliness and purity tells us that the author believes this house is almost immaculate and, you know, without compare, which is probably very different to what you wrote in your description. Your description may have been a little bit more focused on the surroundings, so the trees, the graveyard, the colour of the sky, for instance. And this is neither a right or wrong, they're very different, but it's just interesting to see how someone else has approached it. Okay, so make sure you've got answers to those questions, and then we're going to move on to our next task. And our next task is initially an alternative description of the photograph from another student. And what I've done is mix up the adjectives a little bit. So I've added additional verbs and adjectives to give you a choice rather than just the straight answer. So in this description, the writer says, the parsonage is gloomy, bright, lively, place to grow up in. The echoey, polished, plush corridors seem never-ending, and the watchful, comfy, looming trees in the graveyard cast long, short, thin shadows on the earth, and the gravestones are covered, smothered, layered with moss and leaves. So your task is to look at those highlighted words and choose the ones that convey a more unpleasant or a threatening tone. So the first one you probably would have picked gloomy, as bright and lively is particularly unpleasant. Think about the second one. Which of those three words would be the most useful for an unpleasant or threatening tone? In your mind's eye, you might be thinking of something dark, like dark wood and leather. Perhaps polished or plush is no bad thing. We looked at, in terms of characterization, the contrast between Joe speaking calmly and softly actually coming across as being, rather than filling the reader with confidence, filling them with fear, the idea that something dangerous is going to happen. So echoey is good because something can be empty, and if it's empty, there's always the potential for danger. But if it's polished, it might come across in a more sinister way. So go through the rest of that paragraph, picking those words, and then come back for the next task. Okay, so probably, if I was going to guess, I would say that your watchful trees cast a long or thin shadow on the earth, and the gravestones were layered or covered rather than smothered. Smothered sounds more like a cuddle, which is a bit too nice. So then you want to write a sentence explaining the effect of that word. So if you chose, for example, gloomy, you might say, well, that's dark and dull. So if something was dark and dull, it probably is kind of damp, maybe. There's shadows cast upon it, so it seems a bit more mysterious or spooky. So pick one of those words and explain it why you've picked it, because it's really useful to self-reflect and analyse on why we chose that word rather than one of the options presented. Okay, the third task on this is for you to then continue the description in the same style. So looking at the words you chose and the paragraph that you wrote out with your choice of words, you need to then extend that into the next paragraph. Now, to make that a little easier, rather than just focusing on the outside and the picture of that building, which can be quite limiting, perhaps you need to start thinking about how your viewpoint, if you're thinking like a camera, could zoom into something in that picture, or perhaps take the reader to the house and into it itself. So think about how your paragraph might develop in that way. So take probably 5 to 10 minutes to write your next paragraph, and then once you've finished, come back to the next task. Okay, so one of the ways we can improve what you've written already without me having to actually read it is, I know that you'll have practiced, many of you, adding adjectives in front of nouns and to make them a bit more interesting and developed. But what we're trying to do now is make it more accurate and more like what you can see in your mind's eye, being what the reader sees in their mind's eye. So if, let's say, the subsequent paragraph had begun from the last paragraph had begun with, below me I can see the narrow stony path which winds and twists across the snowy moors. That gives us adjectives around the noun of the path, and verbs portraying the noun itself, so being winding and twisting, can always suggest sort of, again, that sinister air of a mystery. And the snowy moors, rather than just the moors, is obviously another useful adjective in there. It just helps us place where that path leads or where it actually is. So your task is to look at the next paragraph, next passage, and where the coloured blanks are, or the coloured words are, to fill those in. So where it starts with, by the path is a something flower, you need to keep the word flower, but add adjectives that help us continue this gloomy and sort of threatening sensation that is being created in this writing. So work through that paragraph or that passage, adding those adjectives, adding those verbs to make it feel a little more gloomy and kind of mysterious. Okay, now the last thing we're going to do is, as I said at the beginning, the art of this is bringing it together with your character and not keeping them separate. So what we're going to try and do is look at how we use those that writing in a way that is going to benefit your creative writing yourself. So to begin with, look back at the description from Elizabeth Gaskell and find the simile that she uses to describe the key feature on the outside of the building, and ask yourself what effect that creates. Because what we want you to be able to do is think about the similes and metaphors that you choose, and think about not just, does this sound good? Is this a nice phrase? But what's the effect I want to have on my reader, and how might that make them feel about either the setting and atmosphere, or perhaps even the character? So that's your first question. So if you take a minute to go and do that, I'll wait here, and then we'll come back to this task. You need to pause the video though, obviously. I mean, I could just be here all day. Right, okay, so once you've done that, you're now looking at the back of the opening of your short story from the last lesson. So in the last lesson, you'd have started that story involving Joe and one of the other characters that we came up with. And we're going to start developing a place where that short story called The Accident is going to be set. So for now, we're going to start developing that sense of place by thinking about ways in which you can describe the interactions that the characters have with the setting around them, the description that you use, the similes, the metaphors, with the idea of creating an impression in the reader. So those two things are really key: the relationships between character and space, and figurative language that starts developing a precise image of that setting. Now, for instance, if you chose your setting for The Accident to have been when there was a car accident, or when we had one of the pictures where a pedestrian was knocked over by a car, well, you want to create a sense of urgency, a sense of peril, perhaps, that this horrible incident happened and perhaps the pedestrian is in serious pain. So think about how they are interacting with the asphalt around them or under them, how they're interacting with other people around them. If people are walking towards the victim over the solid floor, who cares? Like, boring. I want people moving quickly. We want the rain lashing down, imagery of violence, phrases that make us feel dangerous and threatened, and that this person's life is genuinely in danger. Traffic screeched to a halt. Cars didn't stop. That's boring. So utilising that figurative and descriptive language, because we've now progressed to that, we need to start building that sense of place. So again, I'd invite you to send through your contributions and I'll have a look through them. I'm currently feeding back on a few students who've done some really great work so far. And I look forward to reading some of them, because I think it's really important to develop these skills, because they could become most useful for you in terms of your creativity, but also in terms of something you can, as a skill you can apply in the real world. So creatively writing and creating characters and settings is a fantastic skill to have, but it's also a very enjoyable hobby. So thank you for watching. I hope you got something out of this and you've now started to work on your short story. Hopefully I will see you again soon.